person who we are memorializing today is a guy named F.A. Butt, who was a member of Kolb's, K-O-L-B's battery in the Alabama artillery. It was also known as Barlour's battery. Fought at the Battle of Chickamauga, the Battle of Chattanooga. And if you notice, you can look right back here in the corner, and you see his head. It's in here, behind this tree, this one over here, with an American flag. And we feel, even though he was a Confederate soldier, that it's appropriate to put an American flag. He's an American veteran. I mean, they fought for what they believed in, too. But you'll notice something. His gravestone is peaked. The other gravestone here for his son, who was a veteran of World War I, is rounded. So why is the Confederate one peaked? The story is, hello, Southwest Airlines. It has nothing to do with South. The story is they put a peak on the top because they didn't want any damn Yankees sitting on their headstones. So, the Civil War in New Mexico basically lasted for about 6 months, from the first part of 1862 to about June of 1862. The Confederate commander was a guy named Henry Hopkins Sibley, and he was known as the walking whiskey keg. He had a problem with John Barleycorn.
Yeah.
And he really didn't participate in either of the two battles. He had been here in New Mexico. He had commanded facilities in New Mexico, but he was from the South, and he returned to the South and went to visit Jefferson Davis, and he had a plan. And the plan was he was going to come into New Mexico, and he was going to capture the forts in New Mexico and take over all of the supplies. He was going to come in with a very small group, only about 2,800 men. He was going to come in, capture the supplies, take over the forts. Most of the good soldiers had been sent east to fight in the main part of the war. So it was going to be a cakewalk. Not only that, but the New Mexicans had this process called peonage, which was actually, in many ways, worse than slavery. And he said that therefore the New Mexicans will just flock to my cause, not realizing that most of New Mexico were hard-scrabble dirt farmers who could have cared less about Richmond or Washington and just wanted to be left alone. But Sibley, John Barleycorn, had this vision. He was going to come into New Mexico. He was going to capture the forts, Fort Craig down south of Socorro, Fort Union on the Santa Fe Trail northeast of Las Vegas, and then he was going to march into Colorado. And what did Colorado have? Colorado had gold. And not only that, it had a very vocal group of people, Southerners, who had come to Colorado from Georgia in 1850, and they were very vocal supporters of the Confederacy. So Colorado was going to flock to his cause, and they would bring their gold and enrich Richmond. Now, after he captures Colorado, he's going to turn west. What's just west of Colorado? Utah. What has happened in Utah? Well, they just went through a nasty dust-up between Brigham Young and the Mormons and the Union over the issue of polygamy. So, of course, they were going to flock to the cause as well. What he didn't realize was that Brigham Young was a real patriot. And yes, they'd had this issue with polygamy, but that wasn't the problem. The problem is Brigham Young was a patriot. Okay, so he captures, everybody's going to come to Utah, from Utah to join his army. Then where's he going to go? He's going to march into Nevada. What did Nevada have? Well, they didn't have any people. They don't have many people now. Didn't have many people then. And the stories were that there were silver nuggets as big as your head. And then what's west? California. What does California have? Two things: gold and ports. What was the Union strategy to defeat the Confederacy, the so-called Anaconda concept? It was to blockade the entire South so they couldn't export their cotton. Well, now we have ports in California. Not only that, but there was a bunch of real rabid Southern sympathizers in California. And so he said, okay, California's going to be no problem. So that was his issue. He was going to define the Western Confederacy. When he got this Western Confederacy, England and France would flock to his cause, and they'd win the Civil War. So you can see the influence of whiskey in this vision. All right, so Sibley recruited some men. He went to speak to Jefferson Davis, and Jefferson Davis did a balance, okay? Sibley was not asking for much to support him. He was going to recruit the men himself. They would bring their own weapons, and he would not need very many men. Jefferson Davis didn't have to make a huge investment. And while Jefferson Davis was a very smart guy, he probably said, this guy's nuts. But he said, what am I going to lose? No big deal, right? So Sibley invaded New Mexico, came up from Mesilla. Mesilla had been captured by Confederates earlier on and declared the capital of Confederate Arizona. If you have any friends in friends in Arizona, you could say they were the only Confederate territory because it was declared the Confederate territory of Arizona. So he marched north out of Mesilla, came up to Fort Craig, and made sort of a statement out in front of Fort Craig, right? He lined up his men. Edward Canby, who was the commanding officer of the military district of New Mexico, lined up his men, who were mostly New Mexico volunteers. They were well equipped, but they were not particularly well trained. You know, they fought Navajos and Apaches stealing sheep, but that was about all. The Confederates were many veterans from the Mexican-American War and other fighting, so the Confederates were probably better soldiers. Canby's guys weren't, but Canby lined them up right by the fort. So here are the Confederates over here by a place called Milligan's Gulch, which is about a half a mile south of Fort Craig. And here's the Union. And so they're champions. It's kind of like you think of the Trojan War. You know, here's Hector and Achilles riding back and forth and waving things. My dad can kick your dad and so forth. But there were very few casualties, just a demonstration. And Sibley realized, I'm not going to be able to take the fort. So he retreated back to a place called Paraje, which was a little farther south, and he crossed the Rio Grande on the morning of the 19th of February, 1862. Importantly, the last time they get water, okay? And remember, it's not just canteens. They have a whole bunch of beef stock that they bring along, and all the animals that are pulling their wagons. So they go right up on the ridge over looking the river, and then on the other side Fort Craig, and camp in what's called a dry camp. And the people on Fort Craig, the people from Fort Craig decide that they're going to try and mess up the Confederate attack. And so a guy named Patty Graydon, who was a bartender from down in the southwest part of the state, but who had joined and had run what they called the Spy Company, which is just a reconnaissance company, got a group of guys together, and they went to the remuda where they had all the animals, and they pulled out a couple old mules, and they snuck across the river after dark. This was on the night of the 20th, and they snuck up the hill toward the Confederate camp, and they took some cannonballs, and they cut the fuses short, and they put them in the panniers on the mules, and then they tried to skedaddle the mules in toward where the Confederates were camped. Well, the Confederates had put their horses and everything on the edge of the camp, so they crap up the camp, and the mules start running in, but they're looking over there and they're saying, I don't see anything I like over there. All my buddies are back there. So the mules turn around. And so you can see these mules coming back toward Graydon and his men, and here go Graydon and his men down the hill. And the mules are sent to their reward, and nothing much happens except that about 160 of the Confederate horses stampeded and went down to the river. Remember, they hadn't had water for a while, and the Union captured them. This was the first time that the Confederates had to burn some of their wagons and material, because they'd lost some of the mules and oxen that were carrying them. So, on the morning of the 21st of February, 1862, the Confederates sent out a group of soldiers around what's called Mesa Del Contedero, or Black Mesa. If you've ever driven to Truth or Consequences or Las Cruces from here, you drive right by this big black mesa. It's off to your left, off to the east. It was called Mesa del Contedero because it was a narrow defile where the Spaniards used to drive their sheep because they'd narrow down. It was easy to count them. So it was the counting place. It's now called Black Mesa. And the Confederates come around the east side, and they're looking down at the field of Valverde. Valverde was a crossroad where the east, west, and north-south trails crossed. So they look down. This is early in the morning, February. It's cold. The horses can smell the water, and so you could see the horses whinnying. Guys are looking down with their binoculars, and they don't see anything. They don't see any people. So they go up to the north end of the ford there at Valverde, and they come down on to water their horses. So there are about 160 of these folks. Well, the Colonel Canby was smart enough to have put picket soldiers up there in the brush alongside the river. And so as soon as the Confederates start coming down, these guys start shooting at them. Well, these guys are Texans. They have a few scattered Mexicans shooting at me, no big deal. Well, it turned out to be more than just a few. And so the Confederates actually ride up behind a dry riverbank, the old course of the Rio Grande, and establish a sort of a beachhead behind the berm there, and sent people back to the camp that said, hey, we've met the enemy. They're here at the ford. Similarly, the people who are picketed there from the Union Army go back to Fort Craig and say, they're coming. So now these people start gathering at the ford, and the Battle of Valverde begins. Battle of Valverde was the largest land battle ever fought in the West. Bigger than the Alamo, bigger than Custer's Last Stand, the biggest land battle ever fought in the West. Most people don't know about it because it wasn't written much about until never mind. That's a crass public announcement. So over the day, the early morning, the Union reinforces and the Confederates reinforce. And eventually you have these people lined up, the Confederates behind this dry riverbank and the Union along the river. And you have people like Kit Carson, who was the colonel of the 1st New Mexico Volunteers. And he was there along with a number of other officers. And so eventually you have these group of soldiers, about 2,600 Confederates and about 2,800 Union soldiers. And they're facing each other. And it's a little bit of a deadlock. But Canby comes to the ford around noontime, and two things happen. First, the Confederates decide they're going to try and do something on the left flank of the Union Army, and they launch a lancer charge. These are guys with lances. Okay, lances were a big deal on the parade field, but they don't do very well against muskets. And so they thought, well, we got a bunch of Mexicans over there. That's not going to be any big deal. What they didn't realize was that the people they were attacking was a group of Colorado volunteers who were a bunch of miners just itching for a fight. And so this lancer charge comes down, and the Union volunteers just decimate them. Only lancer charge in the entire Civil War happened just south of Socorro here in New Mexico. So the lancers rode back, threw down their lances, burned them, picked up the weapons of the men who had been injured on their side, and fought the rest of the war with some common sense. So then the Confederates, the Union decides what they're going to do is advance a cannon battery to fight against the Confederates, and they move it out. And at the same time, the Confederates, who were now under the command of a guy named Tom Green, a lawyer, Texan lawyer. I don't know that matters, but they decide they're going to charge. Okay, they're thirsty. They haven't had anything to drink for 2 or 3 days. Some of them are digging down in the dry riverbed to try and get to mud that they can put in their mouth. Remember, these guys are shooting black powder. And the way you shoot a black powder musket is you pull a little cartridge out and you tear it off with your teeth and you get some black powder in your mouth and pour it into the gun and so forth. Black powder doesn't taste very good. It's not like one of these nice chocolate brownies. And so these guys are thirsty, and the mules and everybody else are thirsty, and they're screaming. So the Tom Green decides, we got to do something about this. So he decides to charge. And he charges the battery, but at the meantime, way over on the far right, one of Canby's officers said, we need help because these guys are going to overwhelm us. And so Canby, not knowing what's going on, diverts a company of soldiers who were guarding the right flank of the cannons. Now, the history of artillery in that era was cannons could protect their fronts, but the infantry has to protect the wings. So when he diverts that company to go over to the other side, all of a sudden that end of the artillery is in the air, is what they call it, and the Confederates overwhelm the battery with this charge. Canby then makes what is probably the most important strategic decision of the entire campaign. He orders the retreat. Okay? So the Confederates overwhelm the battery, they capture the cannon, but Canby saves his army, takes them back to Fort Craig. So now the Confederates are in a bit of a fix. They've captured a half a square mile, about this area here, of desert. Okay? They've captured some cannons, they can wave their flags and cheer, but Canby saved his army. And Sibley cannot afford to try and besiege the fort. He doesn't have enough major artillery to do that. He just has these mountain howitzers. And he can't hang on where he is because he doesn't have enough fodder for his animals. So he moves north, captures Socorro by firing one cannon shot, and Socorro surrendered. Establishes a hospital in Socorro, and in fact there are Confederate burials at Socorro. There are also Confederate burials on the battlefield of Valverde. At that time, of course, it was before the river had been dammed and flooded, and so they had, now it's been flooded, and every now and then farmers would find bones that would wash up from the battle, the Confederate people who were buried there. So he moves north, captures Albuquerque. The interesting thing about Albuquerque is they had a big storehouse warehouse down by Old Town, and the commander, Canby, said, take the supplies you can and go north to Santa Fe, burn the supplies you can't, and then evacuate. So the quartermaster, good following orders, collects all the material he couldn't carry, puts it in the middle of the warehouse, and sets fire to the warehouse and leaves. Well, the good citizens of Albuquerque, rubbing their hands together, come in, put out the warehouse fire, and take all the supplies. There's a lesson. If you're going to burn supplies, don't set fire to the warehouse. Set fire to the supplies. Well, they didn't. So the Confederates were pretty well rearmed. They now decide that the next objective has to be Fort Union. So they march north in 3 columns. One goes to Santa Fe, one goes up through Galisteo, and one goes east to meet people at Bernal. And they're all going to link up near Bernal and then march on Fort Union. Well, when the governor, Connolly, had found out about the Confederate invasion, he sent messages out to his neighboring territories and states and said, we need help, we're being invaded. And so the governor of Colorado, Governor Gilpin, said, okay, we'll send some troops down. So they sent a group of troops down under a guy named John Slough. Now John Slough is what I call a genetic military commander. That means his grandfather fought in the Revolution. He had no particular experience. He was a lawyer, eventually became one of the territorial Supreme Court justices for the territory of New Mexico. But he brought some men down, had a little disagreement at Fort Union with the commander there, took most of the troops from Fort Union, and marched on into Glorieta Pass. And they camped at a place called Kozlowski's Ranch, which is now a part of the Pecos historical site. While that's happening, a guy named Scurry is coming up from, Pyron is coming into Apache Canyon. Apache Canyon's that area just inside of the canyon as you drive from Santa Fe into Glorieta Pass. Very nice, beautiful area. A little beautiful church down there, chapel. And so Slough sends John Shivington, a Methodist minister who decided he didn't want to be a chaplain, he wanted to be a fighter, and so he was one of the commanders of the New Mexico Volunteers and Colorado group, and he came into Apache Canyon, and there's a little dust-up called the Battle of Apache Canyon on March 26th. And Shivington's moving down the canyon, the Confederates are kind of moving back, there's a double envelopment, but it gets late in the afternoon. And Shivington is worried that the Confederates are luring him down to the mouth of the canyon where he's going to be ambushed. So he retreats back to Kozlowski's ranch, and the Confederates retreat, and they get some reinforcements from the people who came to Galisteo under a guy named William Dirty Shirt Skirt. He was a lawyer, used to ride the circuit, but he would. How am I doing on time? I got to be careful. Wrap up. Yeah. He would ride the circuit, and he'd come into the courtroom without changing clothes, and so they named him Dirty Shirt. Anyway, so he would come into the courtroom. He came up, and on the 27th, both sides thought they were going to attack, but they didn't. And on the 28th, the Union comes over from Kozlowski's ranch. The Confederates come in from Johnson's ranch, which is on the west end of the canyon, and there's a fight at Glorieta Pass. Now, the fight at Glorieta Pass goes mostly the Confederates' way. The Union is behind adobe bricks, but they have a bastion of rocks up on one of the ridges. These guys are shooting down at them, and eventually Slough decides he better retreat. But in the morning, he had sent Shivington up onto Glorietta Mesa over to the top, and they attacked the Confederate camp at Johnson's ranch and burned 1,100 wagons. Burned 100 wagons and supposedly killed 1,100 mules. That's probably not what happened. Killing 1,100 mules is a non-trivial thing to do. But, so, at the end of the day, Slough has retreated, the Confederates have retreated as well, and it's kind of a stalemate. Once again, the Confederates controlled the battlefield, but the Union had won. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The Confederates could not go on to Fort Union. They didn't have the material or the manpower, and so they kind of turned around there. Eventually, they came back to Santa Fe, came down through Albuquerque to Peralta. There was a Battle of Peralta at the governor's mansion there in Peralta, and then the Confederates left the state. So, what do you learn from this? Well, there were two fights. Neither of them made much difference to the Civil War overall. Both of them made a difference to the Civil War, to the follow-on history in New Mexico. In particular, the introduction of a large number of Anglos into a sort of a laissez-faire Hispanic society. And as a result of that, you had things like the Lincoln County War, the Tularosa Ditch War, and other conflicts that really didn't involve the native populations as much as they did these Anglos. Plus, the issue of statehood was deferred because of the Civil War. So, quick and dirty, if you're interested, there's more in the books. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Is there anybody with this family name still living here in New Mexico?
As far as I know, no. But I haven't looked into it much at all.
Because there's Martin Butt, whose family I think has been here for a very long time, runs a ceramic studio down on North Fork.
Could easily be. I did not know anything about these guys because they didn't fight in the battles I was interested in. But yeah. Other questions? Comments?
Thank you. It was great.
Yes.
Thank you.
I talked about that earlier. That's right. So no damn Yankee can sit on them, right? Anything else? All right, I'll hang around here and people are interested.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.